Okay, we are live.
All right, good afternoon and welcome to the House Environment Committee. This afternoon, we're going to start with a conversation about integrating Vermont's Environmental Justice Act into DEC State Revolving Loan Fund. Long heading. We have two folks here to join us, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm Liz Curry, and I have a consulting practice, Common Land Solutions, that works with mobile home co-ops and other owners to redevelop their water and wastewater and other infrastructure to meet health and safety codes. And I have a 25-year background in affordable housing, public transit, and energy efficiency project development and management.
And I'm Jeremiah Ward with Cooperative Development Institute, and I've been there for 14 years, right around when we launched our New England Resident-Owned Communities program, which helped form 16 of the resident-owned manufactured housing communities in the state. And I'm now director of another program called WISP, Water Infrastructure Support Program, that helps those same communities and some of the nonprofit-owned parks raise capital for infrastructure projects.
So I'm just curious, are you both in Vermont?
Yes, I'm in Burlington and have worked most of my career in Northwest Vermont until I began consulting in 2020 and work with parks around the state.
And I'm in Plattsburgh, New York, across the lake.
Great. Welcome.
Thank you.
Whenever you're ready. Go.
I'll share the screen and then Liz will start off. Let's see here.
All right, so today we're going to talk about the manufactured home community sector in Vermont that primarily owned by nonprofits and cooperatives that use the kinds of funding sources that you see on this cover slide. We are members of the subcommittee, the Manufactured Home Community MHC subcommittee of the Housing and Homeless Alliance, and you're probably used to thinking a lot about other sectors besides affordable housing, but when it comes to MHCs, they many of them inherit, when they purchase the parks, water and wastewater infrastructure that does not meet health and safety codes. And so that's the kind of overarching reason why we are appearing before you to talk about the statutory underlying authority that governs the state revolving funds that municipalities and other types of water and wastewater systems use in order to fund the redevelopment projects.
And I'm going to provide just a brief overview of the sector of manufactured housing communities in the state. So manufactured housing communities, or MHCs, were mostly built between the 1950s and the 1970s as worker housing or RV parks that transition into permanent affordable housing. And they serve low-income populations. Our average park income is $37,000, so about half of what a town's median household income tends to be. And in addition to that, there's a small population to spread infrastructure costs among. So the average MHC size in Vermont is 30 households. The median lot rent of MHCs in Vermont is $413 per month. And that cost covers plowing, trash removal, water, sewer, land taxes. And then the other housing costs that a resident in an MHC pays for is their loan payment on their manufactured home, which typically ranges from $500 to $750 a month. And those are usually high interest rate personal property loans, which are secured with a UCC lien like an automobile rather than traditional real estate. But combined, those two costs are still, they make the housing costs in our MHCs much lower than a lot of the other alternatives of housing across the state. A lot of the infrastructure that was built in these MHCs, from water, sewer, stormwater, and electrical systems, was built poorly with very little regulation back in the day, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And it's surpassed its useful life, and it was never really built very well to begin with in many cases. So there's definitely a need for reinvestment in MHCs. Vermont is a fortunate state that has pretty strong opportunity to purchase laws. So when a for-profit owned MHC comes up for sale, residents have an opportunity to band together and pursue to go the resident ownership conversion route or become purchased by a nonprofit. There are 238 MHCs across the state providing housing to 7,700 households. And 67 of these MHCs are either nonprofit or cooperatively owned, which is about 44% of all lots. Vermont Housing and Conservation Board has funded a lot of these projects, 52. And some of the bigger players in terms of the nonprofit and co-op owned parks are Addison Housing Works and Housing Foundation Inc., which are the two bigger nonprofit park owners. And then my organization, CDI, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, has helped form and continues to provide support to the 16 co-op parks. And as we've already started to mention, there's a lot of infrastructure needs in MHCs. A 2019 VHCB report estimated that 25% of Vermont MHCs have needs ranging from 200,000 to 3 million each. And kind of holding together infrastructure that's in substandard condition and oftentimes failing is very expensive for these communities to kind of keep the Band-Aid solution approach going. So there's definitely a need for federal and state funding to do complete infrastructure overhauls in many cases. And the traditional affordable housing programs that used to pay for these upgrades, like Vermont Housing and Conservation Board and community development block grants through VCDP, don't have enough funding to cover the demand from the sector. And about 6 years ago, Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, recognizing that lack of funding supply, directed us housing providers that work in this space to pursue the SRF program, which stands for State Revolving Fund Program, which is an EPA program that we'll get into in a second, which is very bureaucratic and originally intended for municipalities to use for their projects. And Liz worked on a project at Milton Mobile Home Co-op, around the pandemic period, where she went through the process from start to finish of using this SRF fund. And it became abundantly clear that something has to change if we're going to continue to use this funding source for MHCs. And I'll stop there if you want to add anything, Liz, about that experience.
Sure. So just to be clear, the Housing and Conservation Board and the Community Development Program still participate heavily in these projects, but they were facing a situation where obviously we know that houselessness and other pressing social service needs have kind of created a higher demand for their funds. And so they had to shift their priorities, and as a result told us about the Agency of Natural Resources State Revolving Fund Program. As Jeremiah mentioned, those funds flow from the EPA. They result from the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act back in the 80s when they were amended. And they are intended for our municipal and, existing systems, and certainly opportunities to create new ones, as they should. And we're here today not to compete with them or not to detract from the funding that our municipalities very much need. Indeed, some of our parks are connected to municipal systems. But the challenge with the SRF program is one that municipalities also find, but in general, we're looking at a program that has a very complex and bureaucratic trajectory from start to finish. And one of the things that supports municipalities in using that program is that municipal government in general prefers to move at a slower pace. That doesn't mean they're not frustrated with the program, and that's not your purview, but they are able to move at a slower pace. With the parks, as Jeremiah described, they purchase a kind of legacy infrastructure that has urgent needs, and residents and nonprofits often have to spend between $20,000 and $40,000 a year dealing with emergency drinking water and wastewater problems, either boil water orders, leaks, septic pumping constantly, just a lot of a morass of issues. And so these parks have a need to move more urgently. We have brought these concerns to the Department of Environmental Conservation for the past couple of years. And in parallel to our discussions with them, the Vermont's Environmental Justice Act was passed, which instructed agencies to integrate the environmental justice principles into their programs, and in fact, requires ANR to adopt rules to define and implement consideration of environmental benefits, in addition to instructing ANR to review and recommend updates to statutory definitions. And we've brought this to their attention. They have an annual plan that they have to provide to EPA, as every state agency does when they receive federal funding. They have to design a plan that they give to the federal government indicating their priorities. And we've asked to be more integrated and elevated in that plan as a sector, because the manufactured home sector is the only real kind of privately owned public water system sector that is in its entirety an environmental justice population. They are low income, and they are contending with health and safety issues that they aren't able to meet cost effectively or efficiently without the SRF program working more on their behalf. And so we are seeking to engage the legislature around looking at the statutory opportunity to integrate some of the sector into some of the language, just to elevate it. And that's what the following slides discuss. I think I got a little ahead of my skis, but the next slide describes, oh, sorry, Jeremiah, I'm back on 6. Just indicates that we're looking at the Title 24 Municipal and County Government, Chapter 120, and specific subchapters that address the category of water system and clean water, wastewater that parks would fall under. They're kind of called privately owned systems. So these subchapters would be the opportunities to look at elevating the manufactured home sector as an environmental justice population into the definition in the subchapter 1, into the loan priorities in subchapters 3 and 4. And we can go to the last slide. I know it's a lot of verbiage, but essentially it describes how the definitions in the subchapter indicate that there's hardship municipalities that are described as low income and residential populations of 250 or less, which are characteristics that most manufactured home sectors also have. Not all of them, some of them are larger. And so you can see that the statute kind of gives them a definition of their own in their own right, and we are seeking to have a definition of manufactured home sector as an environmental justice population that is a hardship public water system, privately owned public water system. In the other subchapters, we're looking at kind of the priorities, which are always at the Secretary's discretion, but the plan that the SRF has to present to EPA can identify other priorities besides municipalities. And our goal is to have the MHC sector identified as a priority, again, at the Secretary's discretion in terms of applying the program, but to have it appear as a priority in the subchapter as an environmental justice in order to comply with the Environmental Justice Act. And that would be true of subchapter 4 as well. One is drinking water, the other is wastewater. So one of these, with the language that's highlighted, is just an example of how in the House Housing and General Affairs Committee, there's a member, Representative Gail Pezzo from Colchester, and She is a member of and on the board of Her Park in Colchester, which is a larger park, but she led the park through a process of becoming a village. And that change literally means that now Westbury is a priority under this statute as a village, as a municipality, when it was not a priority as a mobile home park. And that transition to being a municipality means that they can now, they are now recognized as a priority in the statute for water and wastewater infrastructure. So it's just a bit of irony there that that one change means that they can be ahead of the other parks. So we also just thought it was worth mentioning that the state of Maine has a model that we've asked DEC to look at, which has a set aside for small privately owned public water systems, which is the same type that mobile home parks own if they are not municipally owned. And that's a way to kind of facilitate those applications on a faster and separate track from the regular application process. So those are, just to give you an outline, those are the kind of goals we're looking at and asking you to consider, and also very much appreciating your willingness to have us bring this to you and consider it, and looking forward to answering your questions.
Great. Thanks for your presentation and for bringing this to our attention. Do members have questions? Have you, how many committees have you shopped this out to so far?
This is our second. So our first was last week with Housing and General Affairs. And then Chad, I think, approached Chad Simmons is with the Housing and Homeless Alliance and approached you all about the request.
Yeah. And have you, is there more you can tell us about your conversations with ANR so far?
Yes, actually, well, the new deputy commissioner, Neil, came in before was in the hierarchy of the SRF staff. And so when we brought our concerns to the former deputy commissioners and commissioners, we didn't get any traction. When deputy commissioner came and was appointed, he's been more responsive, and the staff have been now engaging us more. It's just the timing is what was problematic, that we've been contending with programmatic barriers and not being a priority in the annual use plan for about for 2 or 3 years, as long as we've been at this. And now they are making overtures to talk with us. Our concern is just that things move very slowly there, and their attention, as you know, is diverted in many, many, many directions. So we are hoping that a process like this would at least create the underpinnings, as the environmental justice law requires, in statutory changes, so that they have a basis for, really kind of assembling a new priority language in their intended use plan.
Further questions from members? Representative Austin.
Yeah, can you just elaborate a little bit on the statement, be denied an equitable share of environmental benefits? When you say environmental benefits, what comes under that?
Sure. So in this case, the environmental benefit would be access to the clean water and drinking water funding, just having greater access, because right now the access is very limited. There's a lot of barriers to accessing it. For example, I recently needed to go through the process of, they have a 3-step loan process: preliminary engineering, then design and permitting, and then construction. And when we finish our preliminary engineering, we have to go to the next step and need to get into design and permitting right away. Otherwise, what's happening now is we often have to wait 8 to 12 months before we hear back about the next loan. During that time, the parks face another year of $40,000 emergency costs. They tend to lose their engineers and they lose all the momentum, and they sit around and wait for the next design and permitting chunk of funds, and we can't get traction. The staff that's involved with Jeremiah's group and me have to move on to other projects. And so as affordable housing projects and all real estate projects have to move quickly, they have to move cost effectively and efficiently through a process of, engineering and design to construction to minimize the cost burden on the residents. And so the environmental benefit here would be minimizing the cost burden on the environmental, on the residents. And delivering clean and healthy drinking water.
Mhm. But speeding up the process.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we believe that would happen if we appeared as more of a called out sector in the statute as a signal to the secretary that we need to be reflected annually in their plan as a priority, not to compete with municipalities, of course, but they are quite flush with a revolving loan fund of at least $20 million. So it's not that we're competing for funding, we're just competing for staff kind of attention and getting moved forward.
Thank you.
Can you speak a little bit to, we know that often mobile homes ended up in more vulnerable or flood-prone locations, and can you speak to how those concerns are being addressed, hopefully before we're investing in new infrastructure?
Or do you want to go ahead, Jeremiah? You've had more experience with that.
Yeah, so there are a number of communities, MHCs across Vermont that are in floodplains, and a condition of using any federal dollars, including SRF dollars, is to complete a NEPA environmental review, which it covers a number of different factors of the environmental impacts of a proposed project. And so part of that process does involve like an assessment and analysis of making sure that the investment in the MHC in a floodplain is a wise use of public dollars. And so we have a couple of projects in the state that do fit that criteria, and we're exploring, alternatives, looking at relocating the communities. In many cases, that's not feasible. So finding mitigating measures to include into the construction project that minimize the impact of flooding, like raising the homes and raising the water treatment building, things of that nature. So it's definitely part of the planning process, part of the federal environmental review process for a lot of our projects.
And the SRF program will pay for engineering costs that involve floodplain mitigation in something like a park. And this is also an area that VHCB and the Community Development Program are very involved in. They will pay for the costs needed to design a solution to either elevate the homes if feasible, or re-engineer rivers, or move the homes if there's land available. So that's a very active conversation in a number of parks.
Further questions? Not seeing any. All right. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time and listening.
Yep. Take care, everyone.
All right, that leaves us with a little bit of space here, so we'll be back again at 2 o'clock.